When a grieving widower shocked an entire Montana auction by spending his life savings on a desperate family of 7, the crowd thought grief had finally broken him. But what Marcus Thornfield did next would prove that sometimes the most reckless acts of compassion can forge the strongest bonds and challenge everything a frontier town believed about the true meaning of family. What happens when a man burns the very document that gives him legal ownership of the people he just saved? The smell of horses and desperate sweat filled the air as Marcus Thornfield stepped down from his wagon in Willow Creek's town square. 3 months had passed since he'd buried his wife Catherine under the old oak tree behind their cabin, and the silence at home had grown so thick it felt like drowning in mud. Marcus pulled his black hat low over his eyes as he walked past the general store where Mrs. Henderson was sweeping her porch. She stopped mid-sweep to stare at him, her mouth hanging open like a fish gasping for air. Word traveled fast in small towns, and everyone knew what happened on auction days in the square. "Marcus Thornfield," she called out, her voice sharp as a hawk's cry. "What brings you to town on a day like this?" He tipped his hat but didn't stop walking. Behind him, he could hear her whispering to another woman who'd come out to see what was happening. Their words followed him like buzzing flies. "Poor man's finally lost his mind. Grief does terrible things. What would Catherine think?" The auction block stood in the center of the square like a giant wooden tooth. It was built from thick oak planks that had turned dark brown from years of rain and sun. Marcus had walked past this block hundreds of times in his 42 years, but today it looked different. Today it looked hungry. People were gathering around the block like vultures circling a dying animal. Some were farmers looking for workers to help with harvest time. Others were saloon owners needing serving girls. A few were just curious folks who came to watch other people's misery like it was some kind of show. Marcus found a spot near the back of the crowd and leaned against a wooden post. His hands were shaking, though he couldn't say why. The sun beat down on his back, making sweat run down his spine like tiny rivers. He pulled out his pocket watch, the one Catherine had given him on their wedding day, and saw that it was nearly 2 o'clock. "Ladies and gentlemen," the auctioneer's voice boomed across the square like thunder before a storm. "Welcome to today's proceedings. We have several fine lots for your consideration." The man on the platform was tall and thin, with a mustache that curled at the ends like a pig's tail. His name was Chester Mills, and he'd been running auctions in Willow Creek for more than 10 years. Marcus had bought horses from him before, back when life was normal and buying horses was the worst thing a man might do at an auction. The first lot was a young man who owed money to the bank. He stood on the block with his head down, his hands tied behind his back with rough rope. The bidding started at $5 and went up quickly. A rancher from outside town bought him for $37 to work cattle through the winter. Next came an old woman whose husband had died owing money to the general store. She could cook and clean, the auctioneer said, and she knew how to make medicine from wild plants. A family with 6 children bought her for $15, and Marcus watched her climb down from the block with tears running down her wrinkled cheeks. After each sale, Marcus felt something cold and hard growing in his chest. These weren't animals being sold. These were people, mothers and fathers and children who'd fallen on hard times just like anyone might. The crowd around him laughed and joked like they were at a county fair, but all Marcus could think about was Catherine's voice the night before she died. "Promise me something, Marcus," she'd whispered, her hand so light in his it felt like holding a baby bird. "Promise me you'll find a way to do some good in this world. Don't let the sadness win." He'd promised, of course. A man promises his dying wife anything she asks. But in the 3 months since her funeral, he hadn't kept that promise. He'd barely left his cabin except to buy food and supplies. The crops sat unharvested in his fields, and the house echoed with emptiness that seemed to grow bigger every day. "Next lot," Chester Mills called out, and Marcus's attention snapped back to the platform. A family unit. 7 souls in total, including the mother. Marcus felt his heart stop beating for a moment, then start up again twice as fast. A family was being led onto the platform. A woman and 6 children who looked like they'd been carved from the same piece of wood. They all had the same golden hair and the same way of holding their heads high even though their clothes were patched and worn. The woman couldn't have been more than 35 years old, but her face showed the kind of lines that come from worry rather than laughter. She wore a blue dress that had been mended so many times it looked like a patchwork quilt. Her arms were wrapped around the smallest child, a boy who might have been 4 or 5 years old. The other children stood behind her like soldiers in formation. There were twin girls who looked about 8, a serious boy of maybe 12, 2 teenage girls, and a tall boy who was almost a man. The oldest boy's hands were clenched into fists at his sides, and his jaw was set like he was ready to fight anyone who came near his family. "The Brennan family," Chester Mills announced, reading from a paper in his hand. "Finest seamstress this side of the Mississippi River. The woman can cook, clean, sew, and manage a household. Children aged 4 to 16, all healthy, all willing workers." Marcus stared at the family on the platform and felt something break open inside his chest. The woman, Mrs. Brennan, was looking out over the crowd with eyes that reminded him of a cornered animal. She was scared, but she wasn't broken. Not yet. "The family comes with a full set of sewing supplies," Chester continued, "including a Singer sewing machine in excellent condition. They also have letters of recommendation from previous employers. Bidding starts at $10. $10 for 7 human lives." Marcus felt sick to his stomach. "15, called out a voice from the crowd. "20, shouted another. Marcus recognized the second voice. It belonged to Jake Morrison, a man who owned a large ranch outside town. Morrison was known for working his hired hands from sunrise to sunset with barely enough food to keep them alive. The thought of the Brennan family, especially those young children, ending up with Morrison made Marcus's blood turn to ice water. The bidding continued, climbing slowly toward $30. Mrs. Brennan stood perfectly still on the platform, but Marcus could see her hands trembling where they held her youngest child. The boy was trying to be brave, but tears were running down his cheeks like raindrops on a window. That's when Marcus heard Catherine's voice again, as clear as if she were standing right beside him. "Don't let the sadness win. $35. Jake Morrison's voice cut through the afternoon air like an axe through wood. He stood near the front of the crowd, his thumbs hooked in his belt, looking pleased with himself like a cat who'd caught a particularly fat mouse. Marcus felt his hands curl into fists inside his coat pockets. He'd seen Morrison's ranch hands come into town on Saturday nights, their faces hollow with exhaustion and their clothes hanging loose on their skinny frames. Morrison fed his workers just enough to keep them alive and worked them just short of killing them. On the platform, Mrs. Brennan's face had gone white as fresh snow. She knew Morrison's reputation just like everyone else in the territory. The oldest boy, her 16-year-old son, took a step forward like he might jump down from the platform and run, but his mother's hand shot out to stop him. "Easy, Benjamin," she whispered, her voice so quiet that only Marcus seemed to hear it. "Stay with your brothers and sisters. Benjamin." The boy's name was Benjamin, and he was trying to protect his family the only way he knew how. Marcus felt a sharp pain in his chest as he remembered being 16 himself, desperate to be the man of the house after his own father died in a mining accident. $40, someone else called out. Marcus turned to see who had bid and felt his stomach drop even further. It was Dutch Cartwright, who ran the biggest saloon in town. Dutch was always looking for pretty girls to serve drinks and keep the customers happy. His eyes were fixed on the 2 teenage girls, and the look on his face made Marcus want to punch him right in his yellow teeth. Mrs. Brennan saw where Dutch was looking, and she pulled her daughters closer to her side. The girls couldn't have been more than 14 and 15 years old, just babies. Really, though they were trying hard to look grown up and brave. $45, Morrison called out, not to be outdone. Chester Mills wiped sweat from his forehead with a dirty handkerchief. "Excellent bidding, gentlemen. Do I hear 50? The crowd was getting excited now, sensing that something big was about to happen. People were pushing closer to the platform, craning their necks to get a better look at the family being sold like cattle at market. Marcus closed his eyes and tried to think. He had money, Catherine's life insurance money that he'd been keeping in a coffee tin under his bed. $300 that was supposed to help him start over after losing his wife. $300 that was supposed to buy him a new life somewhere far away from all the memories that haunted his cabin. But what kind of new life could he have, knowing he'd watched a family get torn apart when he had the power to stop it? $50. Dutch Cartwright called out, his voice oily with satisfaction. On the platform, the youngest boy started to cry harder. The sound was like a knife twisting in Marcus's heart. The child was scared and confused, clinging to his mother's skirts like they were the only solid thing in a world that had suddenly turned upside down. The twin girls were holding hands so tightly their knuckles had turned white. The 12-year-old boy was trying to look tough, but Marcus could see his lower lip trembling. The teenage girls had their arms around each other, their eyes wide with the kind of fear that comes from understanding exactly what might happen to them. And Mrs. Brennan, brave, desperate Mrs. Brennan, was whispering something to her children. Marcus couldn't hear the words, but he could see her lips moving in what looked like a prayer. 55. Morrison shouted, determination making his voice rough. 60. Dutch fired back immediately. The bidding was getting serious now. These men wanted this family, and they were willing to pay for the privilege of owning 7 human beings. The thought made Marcus feel like he might throw up right there in the town square. He thought about Catherine again, lying in that hospital bed in Helena with her hand in his. She'd been so thin by then that her wedding ring kept sliding around on her finger like a hula hoop. But her eyes had still been bright with the same kindness that had made him fall in love with her 15 years earlier. "You have such a good heart, Marcus Thornfield," she told him that last night. "Don't let this world make you hard. Don't let losing me make you forget how to love." Love. That was what this was about, wasn't it? Not the romantic love he'd shared with Catherine, but the bigger kind of love that made a person care about strangers. The kind of love that couldn't stand by and watch innocent people get hurt when there was anything that could be done to help. $70. Morrison was getting red in the face now, angry that Dutch was making him work so hard for what he wanted. 75. Dutch shot back, grinning like the devil himself. Marcus pulled out his pocket watch again. 3:15. In 15 minutes, this would all be over. The Brennan family would belong to either Morrison or Dutch, and there would be nothing anyone could do to change it. The law was the law even when the law was wrong. Unless Marcus stepped forward, his heart pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears like drums at a war dance. His mouth felt dry as desert sand, but somehow he managed to find his voice. $100. The entire crowd turned to stare at him like he'd just sprouted wings and started flying around the square. Even Chester Mills looked surprised, his hammer frozen halfway to the gavel. Mrs. Brennan's eyes found his across the sea of faces, and Marcus felt something pass between them. A moment of understanding that needed no words. She didn't know who he was or why he was bidding, but she could see something in his face that gave her hope. $100 from the gentleman in the back. Chester called out, his voice cracking with excitement. "Do I hear 110? Morrison spun around to glare at Marcus, his face twisted with anger. "Who the hell do you think you are, Thornfield? Just a man with money to spend?" Marcus replied, surprised by how steady his voice sounded. 110. Dutch called out, not willing to give up his prize. Marcus's hands were shaking now, but his voice stayed strong. 150. Gasps went up from the crowd. That was more money than most people in Willow Creek saw in 6 months. Mrs. Henderson from the general store was fanning herself with her apron like she might faint from the excitement. 160. Morrison shouted, his face now purple with rage. 170. Dutch countered. Marcus reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the small leather pouch where he kept his emergency money. There were gold coins in there, double eagles that caught the sunlight and threw it back like tiny suns. He'd been saving those coins for something special, though he'd never known what that something might be. Now he knew. $200, he called out, his voice carrying clearly across the square. The crowd fell silent except for the sound of people breathing hard and the distant lowing of cattle from the stockyards. Even the children on the platform stopped crying, sensing that something important was happening. Morrison and Dutch were both staring at him now, their faces showing the kind of shock that comes from being hit by lightning. $200 was more than either of them had expected to pay, more than they could afford without seriously hurting their other business interests. Chester Mills was grinning like Christmas morning. $200. Do I hear 210? The silence stretched out like taffy being pulled. Morrison looked like he wanted to bid higher, but Marcus could see him doing calculations in his head. Dutch was chewing on his mustache, clearly weighing whether these particular people were worth bankrupting himself over. Finally, Morrison spat in the dust and turned away. "Ain't no family worth that kind of money," he muttered, but Marcus could hear the defeat in his voice. Dutch held out a little longer, but eventually he shook his head and stepped back into the crowd. $200 going once, Chester called out, raising his hammer high in the air. Marcus felt time slow down like honey running off a spoon. This was it, the moment that would change everything. There would be no going back after this, no pretending he was just a simple farmer who minded his own business. Going twice. On the platform, Mrs. Brennan was staring at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Hope and fear were mixed together in her eyes like oil and water, and he could see her trying to figure out what kind of man would spend his life savings on strangers. Marcus hoped she would never have to find out how broken he really was inside. Sold. Chester's hammer came down with a sound like thunder, and just like that, Marcus Thornfield owned 7 human beings. God help him, what had he done? The wagon wheels creaked like old bones as they rolled away from Willow Creek, carrying Marcus and his newly purchased family toward an uncertain future. The silence between them was so thick you could have cut it with a butter knife and served it for dinner. Mrs. Brennan sat beside Marcus on the driver's bench, her back straight as a fence post and her hands folded in her lap like she was sitting in church. But Marcus could see her fingers trembling every time the wagon hit a bump in the road. Behind them, the 6 children huddled together among their few belongings like baby birds in a nest after a storm. The youngest boy, Timothy, Marcus had heard one of the girls call him, kept sniffling and wiping his nose on his sleeve. The twin girls sat on either side of him, their arms wrapped around his small shoulders. They looked like they were trying to disappear into the wooden sides of the wagon. Benjamin, the 16-year-old, sat at the very back with his arms crossed and his jaw set like concrete. His eyes never stopped moving, scanning the countryside like he was planning an escape route. Every few minutes, he would look at Marcus's back with an expression that could have melted steel. The 2 teenage girls, Margaret and Ruth, Marcus thought he'd heard, were whispering to each other in voices so low that even the wind couldn't carry their words. Their eyes were red from crying, but they'd stopped making noise after the first mile out of town. The 12-year-old boy, whose name Marcus still didn't know, sat between his older brother and sisters like a guard dog protecting his pack. Marcus guided his horses around a deep rut in the road and tried to think of something to say. What did a man say to a family he'd just bought at auction? Nice weather we're having seemed a bit ridiculous under the circumstances. The late afternoon sun was painting the Montana hills in shades of gold and orange, and a cool breeze was starting to blow down from the mountains. It would be getting dark soon, and they still had 3 miles to go before they reached his cabin. "Mama," Timothy whispered from the back of the wagon, his voice small and scared. "Are we slaves now?" The question hit Marcus like a punch to the stomach. He felt Mrs. Brennan go rigid beside him, and the silence that followed was even heavier than before. "I don't know, sweetheart," Mrs. Brennan finally answered, her voice steady despite the fear Marcus could hear underneath. "We'll have to wait and see." Marcus cleared his throat and turned slightly in his seat so the children could see his face. "You're not slaves," he said quietly. "I want to make that clear right away." Benjamin leaned forward, his young face hard with suspicion. "Then what are we? You paid money for us. You own us now according to the law. What's that make us if not slaves?" The boy's words were like arrows, each one finding its mark in Marcus's already guilty conscience. How could he explain what he'd done when he wasn't entirely sure himself? How could he make them understand that he'd acted on impulse, driven by grief and Catherine's dying words about doing good in the world? "It makes you," Marcus paused, searching for the right words. "It makes you people who needed help, and me someone who had the means to help." "Help?" Margaret, one of the teenage girls, spoke up for the first time. Her voice was sharp with bitter experience. Men like you don't help people like us. Men like you buy us because they want something. Marcus felt heat rise in his cheeks. She wasn't wrong. Most men who bought families at auction had specific plans for what they wanted from their purchases. The fact that he didn't have such plans probably made him seem even more suspicious. I understand why you'd think that, he said carefully. And I don't blame you for not trusting me. But I give you my word, my wife's memory as my witness, that I don't want anything from you except to know that you're safe. Mrs. Brennan turned to study his profile, her green eyes searching his face like she was trying to read his soul. Your wife? She asked softly. Catherine. The name came out rougher than Marcus intended. She died 3 months ago. Cancer. The explanation hung in the air between them like smoke from a campfire. Mrs. Brennan's expression softened slightly, though wariness still lurked in her eyes. I'm sorry for your loss, she said, and Marcus could tell she meant it. Losing a spouse is difficult. Yes, ma'am, it is. Marcus guided the horses around another bend in the road. Catherine always said I had more heart than sense. I reckon she was right about that. They rode in silence for another mile before Mrs. Brennan spoke again. Mr. Thornfield, Marcus, what exactly do you expect from us? What are the arrangements you have in mind? Marcus had been dreading this question because he honestly didn't have a good answer. He'd acted on pure instinct back at the auction, driven by the need to do something, anything, to help. But he hadn't thought through the practical details of what came next. Well, he said slowly, I've got a cabin with extra rooms. There's plenty of food in the pantry and a good well for water. I've got chickens for eggs and a cow for milk. The roof doesn't leak, and the walls are thick enough to keep out the winter cold. And in exchange? Benjamin's voice cut through the air like a blade. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, listening to the steady clip-clop of his horse's hooves on the packed dirt road. In the distance, he could see smoke rising from his chimney. He'd banked the fire before leaving that morning, and it was still burning. In exchange, he said finally, you let me know that I did something right for once in my life. The answer seemed to surprise them. Mrs. Brennan blinked several times, like she was trying to process what he'd said. Even Benjamin looked caught off guard, his permanent scowl wavering for just a moment. That's it? Ruth, the other teenage girl, asked. You spent $200 just so you could feel good about yourself? I spent $200, Marcus corrected gently. So 7 people wouldn't have to find out what Jake Morrison and Dutch Cartwright had planned for them. The mention of those names made everyone in the wagon go quiet again. They all knew Morrison's reputation for working his people to death. And they all knew what Dutch Cartwright wanted from young girls. As they crested the final hill before his valley, Marcus felt his chest tighten with nerves. Below them, his cabin sat nestled among tall pine trees like a child's toy house. Catherine had planted flower gardens around the porch, and even though he'd neglected them since her death, a few hardy sunflowers were still blooming. The cabin looked smaller than he remembered and shabbier. Would it be big enough for 7 extra people? Would they think it was suitable, or would they see it as just another kind of prison? There it is, he said, pointing down the slope. Home. Mrs. Brennan studied the cabin with an expression Marcus couldn't read. The children pressed forward to get a better look, their earlier fear momentarily replaced by curiosity. It's pretty, little Timothy said, and Marcus felt something warm uncurl in his chest. Mama, one of the twins whispered, look at all the trees. And is that a creek running behind the house? Yes, Marcus said, grateful to talk about something practical. Miller's Creek. The water's clean and cold, even in summer. Good for drinking and washing. There's a swimming hole about a quarter-mile upstream where the water gets deeper. The wagon rolled down the hill and came to a stop in front of the cabin. Marcus climbed down and turned to help Mrs. Brennan, but she was already stepping down on her own, her movements careful and dignified despite everything they'd been through. The children climbed out more slowly, staying close together as they looked around at their new surroundings. Benjamin kept one hand on Timothy's shoulder while his eyes swept the area like he was cataloging escape routes and potential dangers. Marcus walked to the back of the wagon and started unloading their belongings. There wasn't much. A few bundles of clothes, the sewing machine Chester Mills had mentioned, a worn Bible, and a small wooden box that Mrs. Brennan held like it contained something precious. "The children can take the loft," Marcus said, gesturing toward the ladder that led to the upper level of the cabin. "There's plenty of room up there, and it stays warm in winter because heat rises." He turned to Mrs. Brennan, suddenly aware of how improper the whole situation was. A widower and a widow living under the same roof without being married, tongues would wag from here to Helena if word got out. "There's a small room off the kitchen," he continued, his cheeks warming with embarrassment. "Catherine used it for her sewing. It has a window that looks out on the flower garden, and—" He paused, meeting her eyes directly. "It has a lock on the door, on the inside." Mrs. Brennan's eyebrows went up in surprise. "A lock? From the inside?" "Yes, ma'am. I want you to feel safe here. All of you." Marcus gestured toward the children, who were still clustered together like sheep in a thunderstorm. "I know you have no reason to trust me yet. I know this whole situation is—" He searched for the right word, "unusual. But I need you to understand something important." He walked over to his saddlebags and pulled out a folded piece of paper, the bill of sale that legally made him the owner of 7 human lives. The document was still crisp and new, the ink barely dry from where Chester Mills had filled in the details. Without a word, Marcus walked to the stone fireplace that dominated one wall of the cabin's main room. He opened the damper and tossed the paper into the cold ashes from last night's fire. "Benjamin," he said, turning to the oldest boy, "would you fetch me some kindling from the woodpile behind the house?" Benjamin looked confused but did as he was asked, returning with an armload of dry twigs and small branches. Marcus arranged the kindling over the bill of sale and struck a match. The paper caught fire quickly, curling and blackening as the flames consumed the words that had made the Brennan family his legal property. Within moments, there was nothing left but ash and smoke drifting up the chimney. "There," Marcus said, dusting off his hands. "Now nobody owns anybody. We're just people helping each other get by." The family stared at him like he'd just performed a magic trick. Mrs. Brennan's hand flew to her throat, and her eyes filled with tears. But that was your proof of purchase," she stammered. "Without that paper, you can't prove you bought us legally. If someone challenges your right to—" "To what?" Marcus interrupted gently. "To own human beings? Good. I hope someone does challenge it." Benjamin was looking at him with an expression that might have been the beginning of respect. "You really burned it. You really burned the paper that said we belong to you. You never belonged to me, son. People don't belong to other people. That paper was just a lie written down in fancy legal language." Little Timothy tugged on his mother's skirt. "Mama, does this mean we're free?" Mrs. Brennan knelt down and gathered her youngest child into her arms, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I think," she whispered, "it means we have a chance to find out what freedom looks like." The first rays of dawn were painting the Montana sky pink and gold when Marcus woke to the sound of someone moving around in his kitchen. For a moment, he lay in his bed listening to the gentle clattering of pots and pans, and his heart did something it hadn't done in 3 months. It felt lighter. He'd spent the night on the small cot in his workshop, giving his bedroom to Mrs. Brennan and the younger children while the older boys made beds for themselves in the hayloft above the barn. It wasn't the most comfortable arrangement, but it was better than anything the family had experienced in weeks. Marcus pulled on his clothes and boots, ran his fingers through his hair, and stepped into the main room of the cabin. What he saw there stopped him in his tracks like he'd walked into an invisible wall. Mrs. Brennan stood at his stove, her golden hair pinned up neatly and an apron tied around her waist. She was humming softly while she cooked, and the smell of bacon and fresh biscuits filled the air like the sweetest perfume. The twins Lucy and Lily, he'd learned their names last night, were setting the table with his good dishes, the ones Catherine had saved for special occasions. Timothy sat on a wooden stool near the fireplace, playing with a carved horse that Marcus had whittled years ago during a long winter. The toy had been gathering dust on a shelf, but now it was galloping across the little boy's imagination like it had been born to be loved by small hands. "Good morning, Mr. Thornfield," Mrs. Brennan said without turning around. "I hope you don't mind that I took the liberty of making breakfast. I found eggs in your chicken coop and bacon in your smokehouse." "I don't mind at all," Marcus said, though his voice came out rougher than he'd intended. "It smells wonderful. I haven't had a proper breakfast in quite some time." She turned to look at him then, and he was struck again by how young she seemed despite the worry lines around her eyes. "Where would you like me to serve you? At the head of the table, I assume?" The question caught Marcus off guard. In her mind, he was still the master of the house and she was still his servant? Housekeeper? The boundaries of their new relationship were as murky as creek water after a storm. "Mrs. Brennan," he said carefully, "I was hoping we could all eat together, like a family." Her hand paused in the act of flipping bacon, and she gave him a look that was part surprise and part suspicion. "Together? All of us?" "Yes, ma'am, if that's all right with you." Before she could answer, the cabin door opened and Benjamin came in carrying a bucket of fresh milk from the cow. His hair was mussed from sleep, and there was hay stuck to his shirt, but his eyes were alert and watchful as always. "Morning," he said to Marcus, his tone carefully neutral. "Your cow's a good milker. Got near a gallon from her." "She's a sweet old girl," Marcus replied. "Her name's Buttercup. Catherine named her." The mention of his dead wife seemed to soften something in Benjamin's expression. "Buttercup's a good name for a cow." Margaret and Ruth came down from the loft a few minutes later, followed by the 12-year-old boy whose name Marcus still hadn't learned. The boy was quieter than his siblings, hanging back and watching everything with serious dark eyes. "What's your name, son?" Marcus asked gently. The boy looked to his mother before answering. "Daniel, sir. Daniel Brennan." "Well, Daniel Brennan, would you like to help me feed the chickens after breakfast? They get cranky if their meal is late." Daniel nodded solemnly, and Marcus caught a glimpse of a small smile tugging at the corner of the boy's mouth. They all sat down around the table, Marcus at one end, Mrs. Brennan at the other, and the children arranged along the sides like they'd been doing it for years instead of for the first time. Mrs. Brennan had cooked enough food to feed an army. Bacon and eggs, fresh biscuits with honey, fried potatoes, and milk still warm from the cow. "This is delicious," Marcus said after his first bite, and he meant it. "I haven't eaten this since Catherine was cooking." "Thank you," Mrs. Brennan said quietly. "Cooking for a family again feels." She paused, searching for the right words. "Feels normal." Little Timothy was eating his eggs with the concentrated attention that only very young children can muster. His face was smeared with egg yolk, and he was swinging his legs under the table like he was keeping time to music only he could hear. "Mr. Marcus," he said suddenly, looking up from his plate, "are you going to keep us forever?" The innocent question hit the table like a thunderclap. Everyone stopped eating and stared at the little boy, who seemed completely unaware that he'd just asked something monumentally complicated. Marcus set down his fork and looked into Timothy's bright blue eyes. "I'm going to keep you as long as you want to stay," he said honestly. "And if you ever want to leave, you're free to go." "But where would we go?" Lucy, one of the twins, asked. "We don't have anywhere else." It was Margaret who answered, her teenage voice bitter with experience. "We could go to another auction block. Or we could try to make it on our own and probably starve or freeze before winter's over." "Margaret," Mrs. Brennan said sharply, "that's enough. It's the truth, Mama, and you know it. We're stuck here whether we like it or not." The words hung in the air like storm clouds, heavy with unspoken fear and resentment. Marcus felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a yoke. These people weren't here by choice. They were here because every other option was worse. "You're right," he said quietly, and Margaret looked surprised that he'd agreed with her. "You are stuck here, at least for now, and I'm sorry about that. I'm sorry that the world is set up so that families can be torn apart by debt and desperate circumstances." He stood up from the table and walked to the window that looked out over his fields. The corn was ready for harvest, and the sight of it reminded him that winter was coming fast. There would be work to do, preparations to make, plans to set in motion. But here's what I can promise you, he continued, turning back to face them. While you're here, whether it's for a week or a year or the rest of our lives, you'll be treated with respect. You'll have food and shelter and safety. And when you're ready to make your own choices about your futures, I'll help you do that in whatever way I can. Benjamin was studying him with those sharp eyes that seemed older than his 16 years. And what do you get out of it? Nobody does something for nothing. It was a fair question, and Marcus tried to give an honest answer. I get to not feel like a complete failure as a human being. I get to honor my wife's memory by doing something she would have been proud of. And maybe... He paused, surprised by the words that wanted to come out of his mouth. Maybe I get to not be so lonely anymore. The admission hung in the air like morning mist, vulnerable and true. Mrs. Brennan was looking at him with an expression he couldn't quite read, and the children were watching him like they were trying to decide whether he was trustworthy or just cleverly dangerous. There's something else we need to discuss, Mrs. Brennan said after a long moment. The practical arrangements. If we're going to stay here, even temporarily, we need to establish some boundaries. Marcus nodded. Of course. What do you have in mind? The children and I will earn our keep. I can cook and clean and do mending. Benjamin can help with the farming. The girls can tend the garden and care for the animals. Daniel can. She looked at her quiet middle son. Daniel's good with his hands. He can help with repairs and maintenance. And I can collect eggs. Timothy added excitedly. I'm very good at finding eggs. Despite the tension in the room, Marcus found himself smiling. I'm sure you are, Timothy. Mrs. Brennan continued, her voice businesslike. In exchange, you provide food and shelter. We'll sleep in the loft and the sewing room as you suggested. But I want it understood that this is a working arrangement, not... She searched for the right words. Not charity. Marcus could see the pride in her posture, the desperate need to maintain some dignity in a situation that had stripped away most of her choices. He understood that need. It was the same thing that had driven him to work 18-hour days after Catherine's funeral. The need to feel useful and competent when everything else was falling apart. That sounds fair, he agreed. Though I hope that over time we can be more than just employer and employees. I hope we can be friends. Time will tell, Mrs. Brennan said diplomatically. After breakfast, they established a routine that felt surprisingly natural. Mrs. Brennan took charge of the kitchen and the household management, organizing the children into teams for different chores. Benjamin went with Marcus to survey the fields and learn about the farm operation. The girls took over the care of the chickens and the vegetable garden. Daniel appointed himself as the official fixer of anything that was broken or wobbly. And Timothy attached himself to Marcus like a shadow, following him around and asking an endless stream of questions about everything from why horses had such long faces to whether clouds ever got tired of floating. Mr. Marcus, Timothy said as they walked toward the barn to check on the animals. Do you think my papa is watching us from heaven? The question stopped Marcus in his tracks. He knelt down to Timothy's level, looking into the little boy's trusting face. I don't know, son. But if he is, I bet he's proud of how brave you've been. Timothy considered this seriously. Mama says Papa got sick and couldn't get better. Like your Catherine. That's right. Sometimes people get sick, and even the doctors can't help them. Are you going to get sick too? The innocent fear in the question made Marcus's chest tight. I hope not, Timothy. I plan to stick around for a long time. Good, Timothy said with the simple finality of childhood. I like it here. The chickens are funny, and your cow has kind eyes. As they continued toward the barn, Marcus realized that something had shifted in the last few hours. The cabin felt alive again in a way it hadn't since Catherine's death. There was laughter echoing from the kitchen where the twins were helping their mother. There was the sound of Margaret and Ruth arguing good-naturedly about the best way to gather vegetables. There was Benjamin's voice from the fields, asking intelligent questions about crop rotation and soil management. The house felt like a home again instead of a mausoleum. But even as that thought brought him comfort, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that this fragile peace was too good to last. Somewhere out there, Jake Morrison and Dutch Cartwright were probably still angry about losing their bid on the Brennan family. Word was spreading through the territory about the widower who'd paid $200 for a family and then burned the papers that proved he owned them. Some folks would call him a hero, others would call him a fool, and a few might decide that he'd stolen something that should have been theirs. 3 weeks into their new life together, the sound of Timothy's scream shattered the peaceful morning like glass hitting stone. Marcus dropped his hammer and ran toward the creek, his heart pounding with the kind of terror that only comes when a child is in danger. He found Timothy standing waist-deep in Miller's Creek, tears streaming down his face as he stared at something floating in the water beside him. At first, Marcus thought the boy had fallen in and was crying from cold or fear. Then he saw what had upset Timothy so much. A small brown puppy, lifeless and still, caught against the rocks. "He's dead, Mr. Marcus," Timothy sobbed, reaching toward the puppy with shaking hands. "I found him floating here, and he's all cold and he won't wake up." Marcus waded into the creek and gently pulled Timothy away from the sad discovery. The boy's clothes were soaked through, and his lips were turning blue from the cold mountain water. But it wasn't the chill that was making him shake. It was the raw grief of a child who'd already lost too much. "Come on, son," Marcus said softly, lifting Timothy out of the water. "Let's get you dry and warm." By the time they reached the cabin, the whole family had gathered on the porch. Mrs. Brennan took one look at her youngest child's tear-stained face and wrapped him in a thick blanket without asking what had happened. "A puppy," Timothy whispered against his mother's shoulder. "There was a dead puppy in the creek, and I couldn't save him." Benjamin's face darkened with understanding. "Someone threw it in upstream. Probably had too many puppies and didn't want to feed them all." The casual cruelty of the statement hit everyone differently. The twins started crying, imagining the poor puppy's last moments. Margaret and Ruth exchanged grim looks that said they'd seen plenty of the world's harshness already. Daniel just stood quietly, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. But it was Mrs. Brennan's reaction that surprised Marcus the most. Her face went white as fresh snow, and she held Timothy so tightly that the boy squirmed in her arms. "Mama," Timothy said, looking up at her with confusion. "Why are you crying too?" Mrs. Brennan wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, but more tears kept coming. "I'm sorry, sweetheart. Sometimes sad things remind us of other sad things." Marcus could see there was a story behind her words, something painful that the dead puppy had stirred up, but this didn't seem like the time to ask about it. "What do we do now?" Lucy asked, her small voice thick with emotion. "We bury him properly," Marcus said without hesitation. "Every living thing deserves a decent burial, no matter how small." They held the funeral that afternoon under the big oak tree behind the cabin, the same tree where Catherine was buried. Daniel had carved a small wooden cross while Mrs. Brennan helped Timothy wrap the puppy in one of her good dish towels. Benjamin dug the grave with the same careful attention he gave to every task. Marcus said a few simple words about how all creatures were precious in God's eyes, and then each family member put a small stone on the grave. Timothy picked a handful of wildflowers and arranged them around the cross with the serious concentration of someone performing a sacred duty. "Do you think he's with my papa now?" Timothy asked as they walked back to the cabin. "I think he's somewhere peaceful," Mrs. Brennan said softly. "Somewhere where no one will ever hurt him again." That evening, after the younger children had gone to bed, Marcus found Mrs. Brennan sitting on the porch steps, staring out at the stars. She'd been quiet all day, lost in thoughts that seemed to carry her far away from the Montana hills. "Penny for your thoughts," Marcus said, settling down beside her. She was quiet for so long that he thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "We had a dog once, before everything fell apart. A little terrier named Patches because he had brown spots on his white coat." She paused, her hands twisting in her lap. "When we lost the farm and had to sell everything, my husband, James, he took Patches out behind the barn and shot him. Said we couldn't afford to feed a useless animal." Marcus felt his stomach drop. Mrs. Brennan. The children never knew what really happened. I told them Patches ran away to find a new family. But I heard the gunshot, and I knew. Tears were sliding down her cheeks now. James wasn't a cruel man, you understand. He was desperate. When a man has to choose between feeding his children or feeding a dog, he makes the hard choice. But it broke something in him. Broke something in all of us. Marcus didn't know what to say. The image of a man driven to such desperation that he'd kill his family's beloved pet was almost too heartbreaking to contemplate. After that, things got worse quickly, Mrs. Brennan continued. James started drinking more, started taking risks with what little money we had left. And when the debts came due, she shrugged helplessly. Well, you know how that story ends. You were there when they sold us. Where is James now? Marcus asked gently. Dead. Consumption took him just before they took us to auction. Part of me was grateful he didn't have to see his family standing on that block. She laughed bitterly. What kind of wife thinks such terrible things about her own husband? The kind who's been through more pain than anyone should have to bear, Marcus said firmly. You survived, Mrs. Brennan. You kept your children together when the whole world was trying to tear you apart. That takes more strength than most people have. She turned to look at him then, her green eyes searching his face in the moonlight. Why are you being so kind to us? Really, Marcus, I need to understand. It was the first time she'd used his first name, and something about the intimacy of it made his chest tight. Because Catherine would have wanted me to. Because it's the right thing to do. Because... He paused, surprised by the words that wanted to come out. Because you and your children have brought life back to this place. Before you came, I was just existing, waiting to die so I could be with Catherine again. Now I wake up looking forward to Timothy's questions and the twins' laughter and Benjamin's help with the harvest. And what about me? The question was so quiet he almost missed it. Marcus felt heat rise in his cheeks. You remind me that there's still good in the world. That people can be strong and kind and brave even when life tries to break them. They sat in comfortable silence after that, listening to the night sounds of the Montana wilderness. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, and an owl called back from the trees. Inside the cabin, they could hear the soft breathing of children who were finally sleeping peacefully. Marcus, Mrs. Brennan said eventually, would it be all right if I asked you to call me Abigail? Mrs. Brennan makes me feel like we're strangers, and I don't think we are anymore. I'd like that very much, Abigail. Her name felt strange and wonderful on his tongue, like speaking a word in a foreign language that somehow meant everything. The next morning brought unexpected visitors. Marcus was in the barn milking Buttercup when Benjamin came running in, his face pale with alarm. Mr. Thornfield, riders coming up the valley road. 3 of them, and they don't look friendly. Marcus's blood turned to ice water. He'd been expecting this day for weeks, hoping it wouldn't come but knowing in his heart that it would. Word of his unusual purchase had spread throughout the territory, and there were men who thought he'd stolen something that should have been theirs. Get your mother and the children into the house, Marcus said, standing up from the milking stool. Tell them to stay away from the windows. Should I get the rifle? Benjamin asked, his young voice trying to sound brave. Not yet, but know where it is. Marcus grabbed his own rifle from where it hung on the barn wall. And Benjamin, whatever happens, you protect your family. That's your job now. The boy nodded with the serious determination of someone who'd grown up too fast. Yes, sir. Marcus walked out of the barn and toward the cabin, his rifle held loosely in his hands but ready for quick action. The 3 riders were close enough now that he could make out their faces, and his heart sank as he recognized them. Jake Morrison rode in the center, his face twisted with the ugly satisfaction of a man who thought he was about to get his way. On his left was Dutch Cartwright, the saloon owner who'd wanted the Brennan girls for reasons that made Marcus sick to think about. And on the right was a man Marcus didn't recognize. Someone with a badge pinned to his vest and the cold eyes of a man who made his living enforcing other people's rules. They pulled their horses to a stop about 20 feet from the cabin porch, close enough to talk but far enough away to make a quick escape if things went wrong. Thornfield, Morrison called out, his voice carrying the authority of someone who was used to getting his way. We need to have ourselves a conversation. I can hear you fine from there, Morrison, Marcus replied, not moving from his position near the cabin steps. This here's Sheriff Dawson from Helena, Morrison said, gesturing to the man with the badge. He's got some questions about your recent purchases. Sheriff Dawson was a lean man with gray hair and eyes like chips of flint. He looked like someone who'd seen every kind of trouble the frontier had to offer and wasn't impressed by any of it. Mr. Thornfield, the sheriff said, his voice professionally neutral. I've received reports that you may be harboring stolen property. Specifically, a family that was sold at legal auction but never properly transferred to your custody. Marcus felt his heart start beating faster. I have the bill of sale, Sheriff. Everything was legal and above board. Do you now? Morrison's voice was oily with false concern. Because I heard tell you burned that paper the very day you brought them home. Hard to prove ownership without documentation. The trap was closing around him with the inexorable certainty of winter coming to the mountains. They'd done their homework, these men. They knew exactly what he'd done and why it left him vulnerable to their accusations. Seems to me, Dutch Cartwright spoke up for the first time. A man who destroys his proof of purchase might be trying to hide something. Might be planning to claim he never owned those people in the first place, so he can't be held responsible for their debts. It was a clever accusation, Marcus had to admit. If he couldn't prove he'd legally purchased the Brennan family, then he couldn't prove he had the right to free them either. In the eyes of the law, they might still be considered the property of their creditors, property that these men were now claiming the right to collect. What exactly are you suggesting, gentlemen? Marcus asked, though he already knew the answer. Sheriff Dawson shifted in his saddle, and Marcus caught a glimpse of something that might have been sympathy in his weathered face. I'm suggesting that without proper documentation, your claim to these people is questionable at best. And when a man's claim is questionable, it's my job to sort things out according to the law. Behind Marcus, he heard the cabin door open softly. He didn't turn around, but he knew Abigail was standing there, listening to every word that would determine her family's fate. The moment balanced on a knife's edge, and Marcus knew that whatever happened next would change everything forever. Sheriff, a clear voice said from behind Marcus, I believe there's been some confusion about the situation here. Marcus turned to see Abigail stepping onto the porch, her chin held high and her shoulders straight despite the danger facing them. She'd changed from her everyday dress into her best blue gown, the one she'd worn to the auction, and her golden hair was pinned up in a style that made her look like a queen addressing her subjects. Ma'am, Sheriff Dawson said, touching the brim of his hat with grudging respect. I'm Sheriff Dawson. These gentlemen have filed a complaint suggesting that your status here might not be entirely legal. My status is quite simple, Sheriff, Abigail replied, her voice steady as a rock. I am Mrs. Abigail Brennan, and these are my children. Mr. Thornfield purchased us at a legal auction conducted by Chester Mills 3 weeks ago. The transaction was witnessed by more than 50 people. Morrison's face was getting red with frustration. But he burned the papers. Without the bill of sale, he can't prove. He can't prove he owns us, Abigail interrupted smoothly, which is exactly what he intended. You see, gentlemen, Mr. Thornfield bought us for the specific purpose of setting us free. The burning of those papers was a symbolic act of liberation. Dutch Cartwright leaned forward in his saddle, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. That's a pretty story, lady, but it don't change the law. If Thornfield can't prove legal ownership, then the original debt still stands. And that means you and your children still belong to whoever holds that debt. Which would be us, Morrison added with a sharp smile. We've purchased the outstanding obligations from the bank in Helena. All legal and proper. Marcus felt his blood turn to ice. These men had planned this carefully, setting up a legal trap that would give them what they'd wanted from the beginning. Without the bill of sale, he couldn't prove he'd ever owned the Brennan family. And if he couldn't prove ownership, he couldn't prove he had the right to free them. There's just one problem with your theory, Abigail said calmly, and Marcus heard something in her voice that made him look at her more closely. There was a confidence there that hadn't been present a moment before, like she was holding a winning card that no one else knew about. "And what might that be?" Sheriff Dawson asked. "Mr. Thornfield didn't just buy our debt, Sheriff. He married me." The words hit the assembled group like a thunderbolt. Morrison's mouth fell open, Dutch's eyes went wide with shock, and even Sheriff Dawson looked surprised. Marcus felt his own jaw drop. They weren't married. They'd never even discussed marriage, though he had to admit the thought had crossed his mind more than once in recent weeks. But then Abigail reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. With movements as graceful as a dancer, she handed it to the sheriff. The ceremony was performed by Reverend Williams from the Methodist Church in Willow Creek, she said smoothly. "As you can see from the certificate, we were wed just 2 days after the auction, which means that even if Mr. Thornfield had retained ownership of my family, which he didn't, that ownership would have been automatically transferred to me upon our marriage. And a woman cannot own herself or her own children. Therefore, we became free by operation of law." Sheriff Dawson unfolded the paper and studied it carefully. Marcus craned his neck to see what was written there, but from his angle, he couldn't make out the details. "This appears to be legitimate," the sheriff said slowly. "Reverend Williams' signature, the church seal, all properly dated and witnessed." "That's impossible," Morrison sputtered. "We would have heard about a wedding. News like that spreads faster than wildfire in these parts." "It was a very private ceremony," Abigail said with the serene confidence of someone telling the absolute truth. "Just the Reverend, ourselves, and our children. We felt that given the circumstances of our meeting, a quiet wedding was more appropriate than a public celebration." Marcus stared at her in amazement. She was lying with such perfect composure that even he was starting to believe her story. But where had she gotten a marriage certificate? And how had she managed to make it look so convincing? Then he remembered the small wooden box she'd guarded so carefully during their journey from town. The box she'd clutched like it contained something precious. Somehow, she'd been carrying the tools she needed to forge a marriage certificate, waiting for the right moment to use them. Dutch Cartwright wasn't giving up so easily. "Let me see that paper," he demanded, urging his horse closer to the sheriff. "You'll keep your distance, sir," Sheriff Dawson said firmly. "This is an official document, and I'm perfectly capable of examining it myself." The sheriff continued studying the certificate, his experienced eyes looking for any signs of forgery. Marcus held his breath, knowing that their entire future hung on whether Abigail's handiwork could pass professional scrutiny. "The ink appears aged," the sheriff said finally. "The paper has the right feel for a document that's 3 weeks old. And I know Reverend Williams' signature. This looks authentic." Marcus realized he'd been holding his breath and forced himself to exhale slowly. Somehow, Abigail had created a forgery so perfect that it was fooling a lawman who'd probably seen hundreds of legal documents. "But even if they are married," Morrison said desperately, "that don't change the fact that he bought her family. Her children were still sold at auction, and somebody's got to pay for them." "Actually," Abigail said with a small smile, "that's not correct either. You see, under territorial law, when a woman marries, her children automatically become the legal children of her husband, regardless of their biological parentage. So when I married Mr. Thornfield, Benjamin, Margaret, Ruth, Daniel, Lucy, Lily, and Timothy all became his children by law." She paused, letting that information sink in before delivering the final blow. "And gentlemen, as I'm sure you know, it's been illegal to buy and sell children in the Montana Territory since 1882. Whatever debts my family may have owed died with my late husband. Children cannot be held responsible for their parents' financial obligations." The silence that followed was so complete that Marcus could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. Morrison and Dutch looked like they'd been hit by lightning, their faces cycling through confusion, anger, and finally defeat. Sheriff Dawson folded the marriage certificate and handed it back to Abigail with something that might have been respect. "Well, Mrs. Thornfield, it appears you know your law quite well. A woman in my position learns to protect herself and her children however she can, Sheriff." "Indeed," The sheriff turned to Morrison and Dutch with an expression of barely concealed disgust. "Gentlemen, it appears your complaint has no legal merit. Mr. and Mrs. Thornfield and their children are free citizens of the Montana Territory, and I suggest you remember that fact." Morrison's face was purple with rage. "This ain't over, Thornfield. We know what really happened here, and we ain't gonna forget it." "You're absolutely right," Marcus said, finding his voice for the first time since Abigail had dropped her bombshell. "It's not over, because if I hear that you've been bothering my wife or children, or spreading lies about our family, I'll be filing complaints of my own. Harassment, attempted kidnapping, conspiracy to commit fraud. I'm sure Sheriff Dawson can think of a few more charges that might apply." The sheriff's smile was as cold as winter wind. "Oh, I can think of several, Mr. Thornfield, and I'd be happy to discuss them with these gentlemen if the need arises." Dutch and Morrison exchanged glances, clearly recognizing that they'd been outmaneuvered. Without another word, they turned their horses and rode away, leaving nothing but dust and the echo of hoofbeats. Sheriff Dawson lingered for a moment longer, studying Marcus and Abigail with eyes that missed nothing. "Congratulations on your marriage," he said finally. "I hope you'll be very happy together." "Thank you, Sheriff," Abigail replied. "I believe we will be." After the sheriff rode away, Marcus and Abigail stood on the porch in silence, watching until the dust clouds disappeared over the hills. Only when they were sure they were alone did Marcus turn to face his wife. "Abigail," he said carefully, "that was the most amazing thing I've ever seen. But I have to ask, where did you get a marriage certificate?" She smiled then, the first genuinely happy expression he'd seen on her face since the day they met. "I made it, of course. I told you I was a seamstress, but I didn't mention that I also know calligraphy, bookbinding, and several other useful skills. When you're trying to make a living, you learn to do whatever people will pay for." "You forged a marriage certificate?" "Complete with the Reverend's signature. I copied his signature from a baptismal certificate in my Bible," she said matter-of-factly. "And I've been to enough weddings to know what the official papers look like. It wasn't difficult, just time-consuming." Marcus stared at her in amazement. "When did you have time to make it?" "Late at night after everyone was asleep. I've been working on it for 2 weeks, just in case something like this happened." She looked at him seriously. "I hope you're not angry that I used your name without permission, but I had to protect my children." "Angry?" Marcus laughed, surprising them both. "Abigail, you just saved us all with the most brilliant piece of quick thinking I've ever witnessed." "I'm not angry. I'm in awe." The cabin door opened, and the children came tumbling out, having listened to everything from inside. Timothy threw himself into Marcus's arms, while the older children surrounded Abigail with questions and congratulations. "Does this mean Mr. Marcus is really our papa now?" Timothy asked excitedly. Abigail and Marcus looked at each other over the boy's head, both of them realizing that the fictional marriage she created had somehow become very real in the children's minds. "Well," Marcus said slowly, "I suppose that depends on what your mother thinks about it." All eyes turned to Abigail, who was blushing prettily in the afternoon sunlight. "I think," she said carefully, "that we should probably discuss making the arrangement official." "You mean actually get married?" Margaret asked, her teenage face bright with hope. "I mean," Abigail said, "that we should ask Reverend Williams to perform a real ceremony. If Mr. Thornfield is agreeable, of course." Marcus felt his heart swell with something he hadn't experienced since Catherine's death, the possibility of a future filled with love and laughter and family. "Mrs. Brennan," he said formally, "would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" "Mr. Thornfield," she replied with a smile that could have lit up the darkest night, "I believe I already am." The sound of wedding bells echoed across Willow Creek's main street as Marcus and Abigail emerged from the Methodist church as husband and wife, for real this time. But instead of the joyful celebration they'd hoped for, they found themselves facing a crowd of townspeople whose faces ranged from curious to downright hostile. Mrs. Henderson from the general store stood at the front of the group, her arms crossed and her mouth set in a thin line of disapproval. Behind her, Marcus could see at least 20 other residents of Willow Creek, including several families he'd known for years. Their expressions told him everything he needed to know about how the town felt about his unconventional marriage. "Well, well," Mrs. Henderson said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Look what we have here. The famous Mr. Thornfield and his purchased bride, making their little charade official." Abigail's hand tightened on Marcus's arm, but her voice remained steady when she spoke. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Henderson. What a lovely day for a wedding, don't you think?" "Lovely." Mrs. Henderson's voice rose an octave. "There's nothing lovely about a man who buys a woman at auction and then pretends it's true love." The children clustered closer to their parents, sensing the danger in the crowd's mood. Timothy pressed against Marcus's leg, while Benjamin stepped protectively in front of his younger siblings. Even little Lucy and Lily seemed to understand that something was very wrong. "Now see here," Reverend Williams said, stepping out of the church behind them. The elderly minister's face was flushed with anger at the treatment of his parishioners. "Marcus Thornfield is one of the finest men in this territory, and Mrs. Thornfield is a godly woman who deserves your respect, not your gossip." "Respect?" called out Tom Bradley, the blacksmith. "For a man who's making a mockery of Christian marriage? Everyone knows this whole thing is just play acting to get around the law." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, and Marcus felt his temper starting to rise. These people had known him his whole life. They'd mourned with him when Catherine died. Now they were treating him like a criminal just because he'd chosen to help a family in need. "You're all welcome to think whatever you like," Marcus said, his voice carrying clearly across the street. "But Abigail is my wife now, and these children are my family. Anyone who has a problem with that can take it up with me personally." "Oh, we intend to," Mrs. Henderson shot back. "Starting with the fact that we don't want your kind of people in our town anymore." "What kind of people?" Abigail asked, her voice dangerously quiet. Mrs. Henderson's face twisted with ugly satisfaction. "The kind who make decent folks look bad. The kind who think they're better than everyone else just because they throw money around. The kind who help families in trouble?" Benjamin interrupted, his 16-year-old voice cracking with emotion. "The kind who give people a second chance when the whole world has given up on them?" Several people in the crowd shifted uncomfortably at the boy's words, but Mrs. Henderson wasn't backing down. "Don't you sass me, young man. We all know what you people really are. Nothing but trouble looking for a place to happen. Mark my words, before this is over, Marcus Thornfield will regret the day he laid eyes on your family." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a fire, heavy and poisonous. Marcus stepped forward, his jaw set with determination. "Mrs. Henderson, I've known you for 15 years, and I've always respected you as a pillar of this community. But if you ever threaten my family again, if any of you do, you'll discover that I can be a lot less neighborly than you might expect." The crowd began to break up after that, people muttering among themselves as they drifted back to their shops and homes. But Marcus could feel their eyes on his family as they walked toward their wagon, and he knew this confrontation was just the beginning. The ride home was quiet, with even Timothy seeming to sense that the adults were worried about something. It wasn't until they were back at the cabin that anyone spoke about what had happened. "They hate us," Margaret said bluntly, her teenage face set in hard lines. "They think we're trash who don't belong here." "They don't know us," Abigail replied firmly. "Fear makes people say cruel things. Once they see that we're good neighbors, their opinions will change." But Marcus wasn't so sure. He'd seen that look in people's eyes before, the mixture of suspicion and resentment that came when someone felt their way of life was being threatened. It didn't matter that he'd been born and raised in Willow Creek, or that his family had helped build the town from nothing. In the eyes of his neighbors, he'd broken an unspoken rule by treating the Brennan family as equals instead of property. Over the next few weeks, the town's hostility became impossible to ignore. When Abigail went to the general store for supplies, Mrs. Henderson served her with icy politeness and charged her double the usual prices. When Benjamin tried to help with the church's roof repair work he was perfectly qualified to do, he was turned away without explanation. The children faced the worst of it at school. Daniel came home with a black eye after fighting 3 boys who'd called his mother ugly names. The twins were excluded from playground games by girls they thought were becoming friends. Even little Timothy was teased mercilessly about his fake papa and his family's shameful past. "Maybe we should leave," Abigail said one evening as she sat on the porch mending yet another torn shirt. Daniel had gotten into another fight, this time defending Ruth from boys who'd made inappropriate comments about her appearance. Marcus looked up from the harness he was repairing. "Leave? This is our home, Abigail. I'm not going to let small-minded people drive us away. It's not about pride, Marcus. It's about the children. They're suffering because of choices we made. Is our happiness worth their pain?" The question hit him like a physical blow. He'd been so focused on his own determination not to be pushed around that he hadn't fully considered the cost to the children. They didn't deserve to pay the price for the adults' decisions. "Where would we go?" he asked quietly. "I don't know. Somewhere they don't know our story. Somewhere the children can start fresh without carrying the weight of what happened at that auction." Before Marcus could respond, they heard the sound of horses approaching fast. Benjamin came running from the barn, his face pale with alarm. "Riders coming. A lot of them." Marcus grabbed his rifle and stepped into the yard, Abigail close behind him. What he saw made his blood run cold. At least a dozen men on horseback were approaching the cabin, and at their head rode Jake Morrison with a torch in his hand. "Thornfield." Morrison's voice carried across the valley like the howl of a hungry wolf. "Time to pay for your sins." The riders spread out in a semicircle around the cabin, effectively surrounding the family. In the flickering torchlight, Marcus could see more than just Morrison and his usual crowd. There were townspeople among them, respectable citizens who'd apparently decided that Marcus and his family had gone too far. "What do you want, Morrison?" Marcus called out, his rifle ready but not yet aimed. "Justice," someone shouted from the group. "You've made a mockery of everything decent folks hold sacred. You've brought shame on our whole community," added another voice. Morrison raised his torch higher, and in its light, Marcus could see the ugly satisfaction on his face. "We've come to give you one last chance, Thornfield. Send that woman and her brats away, and we'll let you stay. Keep pretending this farce is a real marriage, and we'll burn you out." Behind Marcus, he could hear the children gathering in the doorway, their frightened whispers like leaves rustling in the wind. Timothy was crying softly, and he could hear Abigail murmuring reassurances to the younger ones. "This is my land," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through his veins. "These are my family, and you're trespassing." "Your family?" Morrison laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "That woman's nothing but a whore you bought at auction, and those children are." The gunshot cracked through the night air like thunder, and Morrison's hat flew off his head. For a moment, everyone froze in shocked silence. "The next man who speaks about my wife that way gets a bullet somewhere less forgiving than his hat," Marcus said quietly, smoke still rising from the barrel of his rifle. The crowd of riders shifted nervously, clearly not having expected armed resistance. Several of them began backing their horses away from the cabin. But Morrison wasn't finished. "You can't shoot us all, Thornfield, and we've got the law on our side. Sheriff Dawson's already agreed that your marriage is a sham." Marcus felt his heart sink. If the sheriff had withdrawn his support, they were truly alone against the mob. Then, from the darkness beyond the torchlight, came a new voice. "Actually, Morrison, Sheriff Dawson never said any such thing." A single rider emerged from the shadows, and Marcus felt a surge of relief as he recognized the weathered face of Sheriff Dawson himself. The lawman rode slowly into the circle of light, his hand resting casually on his gun. "Evening, folks," the sheriff said conversationally. "Mighty late for a social call, don't you think?" Morrison's face went through several expressions before settling on defiant anger. "Sheriff, good thing you're here. We were just explaining to Thornfield that his little charade has gone on long enough." "Were you now?" Sheriff Dawson's voice was mild, but Marcus could hear steel underneath. "And what charade might that be?" His fake marriage. Everyone knows he only married that woman to get around the law. The sheriff was quiet for a long moment, his eyes moving from face to face in the crowd. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone who'd spent decades keeping the peace in wild country. Gentlemen, I've seen the marriage certificate. I've spoken with Reverend Williams. As far as the law is concerned, Marcus and Abigail Thornfield are legally married, and their children are legitimate members of their household. But Morrison started to protest. But nothing, the sheriff cut him off. What I'm seeing here tonight looks an awful lot like an armed mob threatening law-abiding citizens on their own property. Now, I suggest you all go home before I start arresting people for disturbing the peace. The crowd began to disperse, but slowly and reluctantly. Morrison was the last to leave, his face twisted with rage and frustration. "This ain't over, Thornfield," he snarled as he turned his horse away. "Not by a long shot." As the riders disappeared into the darkness, Sheriff Dawson dismounted and walked over to Marcus. "You all right?" he asked quietly. "We are now, thanks to you. But Sheriff, why did you come? How did you know we needed help?" The sheriff smiled slightly. "Let's just say not everyone in Willow Creek agrees with Mrs. Henderson's assessment of your character. You've got more friends than you know, Marcus." As if summoned by his words, more figures began emerging from the darkness around the cabin. Reverend Williams appeared first, followed by Doc Porter, the town physician. Then came the schoolteacher, Miss Collins, and several other families from town. "We couldn't let them do this," Reverend Williams said simply. "What you've done, giving this family a home and a future, it's the most Christian thing I've seen in 30 years of ministry." Marcus felt tears sting his eyes as he realized that not everyone in Willow Creek had turned against them. There were still good people in the world, people who understood that love and family came in many different forms. As the supporters gathered around the cabin, offering help and friendship, Marcus knew that the real battle was just beginning. But for the first time since the confrontation in town, he felt hope that they might actually win it. 6 months later, the smell of fresh bread and roasting chicken filled the Thornfield cabin as Abigail prepared for their first real Christmas as a family. Snow had been falling for 3 days straight, blanketing the Montana Valley in pristine white that made everything look like a fairy tale. Marcus stood at the window watching Benjamin and Daniel build a snowman with Timothy, their laughter echoing across the yard like church bells. The boys had grown inches since summer, and Benjamin was starting to fill out with the kind of solid muscle that came from hard farm work. More importantly, the wariness had finally faded from their eyes, replaced by the easy confidence of children who knew they were loved and safe. "They look happy," Abigail said, coming up beside him with flour still dusting her apron. 6 months of marriage had been good to her. The worry lines around her eyes had softened, and she'd put on weight that made her cheeks round and rosy. "They are happy," Marcus agreed, slipping his arm around her waist. "We all are." It hadn't been easy getting to this point. The confrontation with Morrison and his mob had been just the beginning of their troubles. For weeks afterward, the family had faced a campaign of petty harassment, broken fence posts, missing chickens, nasty words painted on their barn in the middle of the night. But something unexpected had happened as the community watched how the Thornfield family responded to the persecution. Instead of fighting back with anger or retreating in defeat, they'd simply continued being good neighbors. When old Mrs. Patterson fell ill, Abigail had brought her soup and medicine without being asked. When the Hendersons' barn caught fire, Marcus and Benjamin had been among the first to arrive with buckets and helping hands. Slowly, gradually, the tide of public opinion had begun to turn. People started to see that the Thornfield family wasn't a threat to their way of life. They were an example of it. They worked hard, went to church, helped their neighbors, and raised their children with love and discipline. The turning point had come in October, when an early blizzard had trapped the schoolteacher, Miss Collins, in her one-room schoolhouse with 8 children. It was Benjamin who'd noticed the smoke from the school's chimney disappearing and realized something was wrong. He'd organized a rescue party that included Marcus, several townspeople, and even some of Morrison's former supporters. They'd found Miss Collins unconscious from smoke inhalation, and the children huddled together for warmth as the schoolhouse's chimney had become blocked with snow and ice. If Benjamin hadn't noticed the missing smoke and raised the alarm, they all might have died. After that night, even Mrs. Henderson had to admit that the Brennan, now Thornfield children were as fine and brave as any in the territory. "Mama! Papa!" Timothy's voice called from outside, using the names that had become as natural to him as breathing. "Come see our snowman. He's as tall as Daniel." Marcus and Abigail bundled into their coats and boots to admire the boy's handiwork. The snowman was indeed impressive, complete with a carrot nose and coal buttons that Margaret had contributed from the kitchen supplies. "He needs a hat," Abigail declared, and before Marcus could stop her, she'd plopped his best Sunday hat on the snowman's head. "Abigail," Marcus protested, laughing. "That's my good hat. And now it's Mr. Snowman's good hat," she replied with the kind of playful smile that still made his heart skip a beat. "Don't worry, I'll make you a new one." The girls Margaret, Ruth, Lucy, and Lily came out to join them, their cheeks red from the cold and their eyes bright with excitement. Christmas had always been a difficult time for the family in the years before Marcus, marked by poverty and uncertainty. This year, for the first time, they were celebrating with abundance and joy. "Can we go sledding after dinner?" Lucy asked, bouncing on her toes with excitement. "If the snow stops," Marcus agreed. "But first we need to get ready for our guests." They were expecting company for Christmas dinner. Sheriff Dawson, Reverend Williams, Doc Porter, and several other families who'd become close friends over the past months. It would be the first time Marcus had entertained since Catherine's death, and he was both nervous and excited about filling the cabin with voices and laughter again. As they walked back toward the house, Marcus noticed a rider approaching through the snow. His hand instinctively moved toward the rifle that was never far away, but as the figure got closer, he relaxed. It was Sheriff Dawson, arriving early for dinner. "Sheriff," Timothy called out, running toward the horse with his arms outstretched. "Did you bring presents?" "Timothy," Abigail scolded gently. "That's not polite." But Sheriff Dawson was laughing as he dismounted and scooped the little boy up in his arms. "As a matter of fact, young man, I did bring a few things, but they're for after dinner." Over the months, the gruff lawman had become something like a grandfather to the children, bringing them small gifts and telling them stories about his adventures in the early days of the territory. His presence had also been crucial in keeping Morrison and his supporters at bay. "Any news from town?" Marcus asked as they walked toward the cabin. "Nothing too exciting. Morrison's been keeping quiet lately. Word is he's been having money troubles of his own. Dutch Cartwright sold his saloon and moved on to greener pastures in California. Oh, and Mrs. Henderson asked me to give you this." The sheriff handed Marcus a small wrapped package tied with a red ribbon. Marcus stared at it in amazement. Mrs. Henderson, who'd led the campaign against his family, was sending them a Christmas gift? Inside the package was a beautifully knitted scarf in soft blue wool, along with a note written in Mrs. Henderson's careful handwriting. For Mrs. Thornfield, with apologies for past misunderstandings and hopes for future friendship. Abigail's eyes filled with tears as she read the note. "She made this herself," she whispered. "Look at the stitching. It must have taken her weeks." It was a gesture of reconciliation that Marcus had never expected, proof that even the hardest hearts could sometimes be changed by patience and kindness. The Christmas dinner was everything Marcus had hoped it would be and more. The cabin filled with the sounds of conversation, laughter, and children playing. Stories were told, songs were sung, and for a few precious hours, the outside world with all its troubles seemed very far away. As the evening wound down and their guests prepared to leave, Sheriff Dawson pulled Marcus aside for a private word. "I wanted you to know," the lawman said quietly, "that I've been hearing good things about your family from all over the territory. Word's getting around about what you did buying those folks to set them free, and there are others thinking about following your example." Marcus felt a warm glow of satisfaction. Really? There's a rancher down near Bozeman who's talking about doing the same thing at the next debt auction. and a merchant in Helena who's been asking questions about how to legally free people who've been sold for their family's debts. The idea that their story might inspire others to similar acts of compassion filled Marcus with a joy that went beyond personal happiness. Maybe, just maybe, they were part of something bigger than themselves, a small crack in the wall of an unjust system. After their guests left, the family gathered around the fireplace for their own private celebration. Marcus had carved wooden toys for the boys and dolls for the girls, while Abigail had sewn new clothes for everyone. The children had made gifts for each other and their parents' drawings, carved animals, and small treasures that would be cherished long after store-bought presents were forgotten. But the real gift was simpler and more precious than anything that could be wrapped in paper and ribbon. It was the sound of Timothy's sleepy giggle as Marcus carried him up to the loft. It was the sight of Benjamin helping his sisters with their gifts, acting every inch the protective big brother. It was Abigail's hand in his as they sat by the fire, watching their children and marveling at how far they'd all come. "Do you ever regret it?" Abigail asked quietly as the children settled down for the night. "Everything you gave up to help us?" Marcus thought about the question seriously. He'd given up his solitary grief, his simple bachelor life, his uncomplicated relationship with his community. He'd traded the quiet sadness of widowhood for the messy, complicated, sometimes difficult reality of being responsible for 7 other people. "Never," he said finally. "Not for a single moment. Even when Morrison and his friends were threatening to burn us out? Especially then. Because that's when I realized that this isn't just about helping your family anymore. It's about proving that there's another way to live, a way based on love instead of fear, on inclusion instead of exclusion, on hope instead of despair." Abigail smiled and squeezed his hand. "Catherine would be proud of the man you've become." "I hope so. But I think she'd be even more proud of the family we've built together." As they prepared for bed in the little room that had become their sanctuary, Marcus reflected on the strange journey that had brought them to this moment. A year ago, he'd been a broken widower with nothing left to live for. Tonight, he was the husband of a remarkable woman and the father of 6 wonderful children who'd taught him that love multiplies when it's shared freely. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing their valley in peaceful silence. Inside, the fire crackled softly in the hearth, and the steady breathing of sleeping children filled the loft above. It was the sound of home, the sound of family, the sound of dreams coming true in ways that none of them could have imagined. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. It always did. But tonight, they were safe and warm and loved, and that was enough. More than enough. It was everything.